In this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about recognizing early signs and symptoms of change, because one of our big issues right now, out of 10 people who are living with dementia, only 2 to 3 of them will be diagnosed in the early stage. Most people don't get their diagnosis till mid-stage. And what that means practically is that people have been living life with signs and symptoms of dementia with their care situation for anywhere from 1 to 5 years. Bad habits are developing. People think people aren't trying. What did I tell you? I already told you this. Bad interaction skills, poor communication habits are established. And we miss opportunities to help people plan ahead, think things through, have a plan of action, take part in their own future life. They can't do it if they don't know they need to do it. So what are our early signals? What's going on? Well, let me show you a PET scan. Now, a PET scan is a way of looking at brains and how they're working. It's the chemical picture of your brain. And in this particular PET scan, what we're looking at is how well is your brain burning fuel. And the fuel of note is glucose. Where you see red, a lot of fuel burn. Where you see yellow, fair amount. Green, decent amount, not terrific, but a fair amount. And where you see the dark blue, there's no fuel being burned because there's actually no brain activity going on in there. That's your ventricles, and that's where you have fluid in your brain, and it cleans your brain, and that's a good thing. What I want to point out, both these brains are at rest. We aren't asking these people to do anything but just lay there and let us take pictures of their brain. And the interesting thing is, this is a 20-year-old without brain disease, and this is an 80-year-old with no brain disease. And when you look at these two pictures, you're going to notice not a huge amount of difference between the two. A little less going on maybe in the occipital, visual cortex. It's because I can't handle quite as much incoming data. And I may be a little less stressed than a younger person in these situations because maybe I've had several tests done already. So I'm not as upset or anxious. But otherwise, these brains look a lot alike. Now, what's important for us to remember is that people don't lose function. They aren't going to develop dementia unless something goes wrong. It's not normal aging. And unfortunately, our expectations about normal aging aren't always straightforward, aren't always clear. And because they aren't, we tend to let things go for much longer and not notice that we need to be curious and worried about things and even paying attention to things much sooner than we typically do. We've got a lot going on when people come in for a visit. Now, is there a difference between normal aging forgetfulness and dementia? And the answer is yeah, there definitely is. But at first, it's hard to tell the difference between the two of them because they're very similar, and it's more a question of degree and frequency than it is that it's a totally different phenomenon. It's not. It's how severe and how often it's hitting and how deep the changes get to be. So step one is noticing the difference between normal and not normal aging. So normal, yeah, you're going to be slower than you used to be, but it's about 0.5 to 1% per year change. You're slower to do as well. Your reaction time is slowing just a little bit at a time. You're more likely to hesitate when you're thinking about doing something. You want to think it through and want to rethink before you make a choice. You're much more likely to want to look before you leap, so making shifts or changes in care situations or in living situations or money management or anything, you're hesitating more than your kids want you to, and so they may misunderstand that, or I may miss up on that if I'm younger than you are. You may know the person but not be able to think of their name until you get back in the car. If in fact you were able to come up with it when you paused and you were in the situation, less concerning. Pausing to find words. Sometimes it just takes you a second to locate the word you were looking for, or you talk about the word to get the word to pop. Very normal, especially when we're tired or stressed. However, when you do pause, when you do describe the word pops up for you. It's there, it's just taking longer to go get it. You have a vocabulary that's quite vast. The question is, it's taking longer to get from vocabulary word to vocabulary word. And what I would tell you is you were also reminded of the past in the moment. So you think about the past. You have a rich, full life, and things remind you of things. Very normal, but you don't get confused about the past. You just think about it occasionally. You might talk about it occasionally. And you might bring it up, and it might be present in your mind. And for you, it's harder to live life than it used to be. You have to think about things a little bit more. You have to plan a little bit more. Not normal. You can't think like you used to. You're not doing like you used to. Things are significantly changing for you, and you may or may not be aware of it. You can't either seem to get started, or once you get started, you can't seem to move on. You get stuck on something, and people are noticing. You may notice that you repeat it several times and you can't make yourself not. You're checking, you're checking, you're checking. You can't place someone. You don't recognize the person. Even though it's a good friend, somebody you should know, and you do know, but you can't figure out who they are. They're even in context and you can't figure it out. The words won't come. Even later you can't think of words, the thing, and you get real vague, or you use odd descriptions of things, or you use the wrong word. And you don't realize you're using the wrong word, or maybe you do, but you can't make the other one come out. And you're confused about the past. You're actually misremembering information, or you're thinking something has happened that hasn't, or you're thinking something hasn't happened, and everybody's telling you it did. And you just can't figure that out. And for you, life is very, very different. Now, if I'm caregiving for somebody who's in that situation, what I'm going to tell you is they may or may not know it. I may or may not know it. But somebody from out of town might pick up on it, because what can happen when I'm with somebody all the time is I get so used to it I don't even notice it. And then when somebody comes from out of town, the chemistry of the individual changes. And suddenly they're sharper and clearer. Well, let me just say that also happens at the doctor's office. When we come to see the doctor, suddenly the person that I care about is like, wow, they are doing so well. I think it's on purpose. But it isn't. It's just the doctor's office is a stimulating place. There's lots more data coming in, and the person is perked up because I'm sort of boring and it's everyday stuff. So it creates this feeling that I'm not trying in one situation than I am in the other. It's not what it is. It's just what my brain is able to do in that moment. So the early warning signs for dementia are fairly well identified. I will tell you that not all dementias look like this. And there are many dementias that can hide out in other areas. Yes, it's at least 2 parts of your brain are dying. That's one of the definitions of dementia. And typically one of them is going to be memory related, but it isn't always forgetfulness or inability to hold on to new data. It could be misremembering. An example of that, for instance, is Lewy body dementia. Or sequencing is my main issue. Not remembering people, that might be a frontal lobe dementia. Or it's just mostly language, which might be a temporal lobe dementia. So what we want to be careful of is that memory thing, and that we don't label everything as dementia, but we don't miss opportunities to pick up on it. So how common? Well, by the age of 65, somewhere between 5 to up to 10% of the population is going to have some kind of changes in cognition. Some of it may be dementia, some of it may not, but it's not normal. We're starting to show signs of not normal. By the time we're talking about 85-year-olds, we're talking close to 50% of the population will have cognitive changes that are significant. Some of them life-altering. Many of them making it more challenging and difficult to live the way you've always lived, to do what you've been doing. And on average, a person living with dementia has 3 other illnesses going on. So what that means is it gets more difficult to manage everything when you have a dementing illness, because holding on and being able to interpret what people are saying to you and wanting you to do and managing stuff gets really, really difficult. So is it always dementia? And the answer is absolutely not. Truly. There might be another chronic or acute medical condition developing. It might be depression. And the bad news about depression and other mental health issues is that untreated and unmanaged, it increases your risk of getting dementia. Additionally, there might be a delirium, something really medically wrong, something acutely wrong. It might be that you're on a medication that's causing you problems, or you might be on medications that are interacting with each other, and it could be that you could take them when you were 55, but now that you're 75, it's not working so well. And frequently people have multiple doctors, and I may not be as familiar with what somebody else is doing. You might also want to be looking for hearing or vision changes, because they can be mistaken. And something as simple as me not hearing all the sounds that you make makes me sound like I'm off target, when what it is a hearing issue that I didn't even know I had. Because I can hear the TV, what I don't realize is I've modified how loud I listen to it. And then severe or unrecognized pain or central acting pain medications can really affect me as I get older. And again, because it's crept up gradually, nobody notices that, and they think I have dementia when what I have is problems with my pain or my pain medication. And there are a variety of other things as well. So we know there are a lot of drugs that can affect cognition. This is from the University of St. Louis, Washington School of Medicine. And what we find here is that this whole list, there are things in all these classes that can affect cognition in an older adult. This is complicated. Additionally, it's important to understand that not all dementias are exactly the same, and that there's a state before you see the full-blown dementia called mild cognitive impairment, when the symptoms are inconsistent and they only happen when I'm sick or I'm tired or I'm in a familiar environment and disappear. So what that can mean is people miss signals. With MCI, it's the beginning of the chain, but it's not full-blown dementia. The problem is, if you get MCI, within 5 years, 50% of people will have full-blown dementia. Within 7 years, it's close to 75%. But 25% will never develop it. It's sort of important for us to know who's where doing what, and it's not all about memory. It could be language or behavior or motor skills. So we also want to check out the possibility of dementia versus delirium versus depression. And we need to know what's what. We all know that we should be looking for a whole variety of things. And we know that each of the Ds has a different onset, a different duration. The alertness and arousal will be different. Orientation will be different. Mood and affect, causes, and what we do to treat it and how to manage it vary. We know that it makes a difference between delirium, depression, and dementia. But what we have to keep in mind is we want to know, is it dementia, depression, or delirium? But the reality is it's not easy. Delirium is dangerous. It can be deadly. But when people have all three, as with a chronic terminal illness called dementia, and now on top of that, I'm dehydrated because I'm not thirsty and I'm not hungry, and I have a UTI, we're trying to sort these things out. And it is not easy. It's particularly not easy if we don't have a good baseline on how I was right before this last episode started. And all too often, people don't bother to collect a lot of data. So we want to really be careful that we're assessing for pain or discomfort, for infections, for med changes or side effects, for the impact of physiological issues that might be going on. But we don't always want to go heavy-handed into treating that without looking back and saying, okay, but how does this affect and how does this impact and how is it impacted by the level of dementia? And we have to figure in depression because we know that 50% of people with dementia do develop a depression. And we also know 50% of people with depression ultimately develop dementia. So we should be looking for things that we can do and things that we can't do, but we then want to put them all together and go, but what should we do? The reality is not neat and clean. The reality is three things are often mixed together. And we want to see which D are we seeing now, but how do the three Ds mix together with what we're going to do acutely, immediately, what we're going to do in the short term, and what should we be thinking of in the long term. Because ultimately, we've got to keep in mind that it does matter. What we want to keep in mind also is that screening in the old ways, not particularly effective. The MMSE, Mini Mental State Exam, was created a long time ago when we thought taking that amount of time, 20 minutes or so, to do that kind of screening thing would give us a good baseline to know whether we should work up delirium, depression, or dementia. Well, we don't have that kind of freedom of time so much anymore. So some new things that are out there that you may want to know about are things like the AD8, the SLUMS or SAGE, and a real simple one that takes about a minute, which is huge. And after you've done your first intro piece, one of the things that you want to think about is, can I do something that's going to give me really good data that I can use time and time again? And that's a place for animal fluency. Even your clock drawing, and if you're thinking, I think something is really cooking, you might, early in the disease, want to do a full panel. You might also decide, boy, this has been going on for quite some time. Do I want to put somebody through this? But we don't want to just write them off, and we don't want to make a mistake and not look at it. So the AD8, for instance, very helpful tool. You can ask a family member, and you can ask the person themselves. But most important before you think about the questions are the possible answers. Has there been a change over this last period of time, or has there not been a change? Do you even know what the person is able to do? Are you around them that much? These three answers tell us a lot. If we get 2 change scores on these questions, we should be really checking in. That's a red flag. 1 change score. Something has changed over the last 6 months, 3 months, year. We want to raise a yellow flag and monitor. 2, we need to do something. If nothing's changed, it's very unlikely what we're seeing here is a dementia, because these things typically will change if there is a dementia on board. So we'll go over those real quickly. If somebody doesn't know, we know that 7 out of 10 people in mid-stage dementia are still living alone in the community. It's a problem. These are people who are having significant changes in their abilities, and yet nobody's monitoring. Nobody knows. Families are much more separated than they used to be. Don't assume somebody's keeping track. It's our job to find out. So, does the family member have trouble with judgment? Do they show less interest in hobbies and activities? Are they repeating the same things over and over, asking the same questions, making the same comments, saying things the same way? You're noticing some patterns developing. Do they have trouble learning to use a new tool, appliance, or gadget? Important to note, this has changed. Those who were never good at it shouldn't get dinged. Do they forget the correct month and year? Do they have trouble handling complicated financial affairs? Puts them at very high risk to being taken advantage of by others. This is the fastest area of crime growth in the nation. White-collar crime growth against people with early signs of dementia and mid-stage dementia, because they're out there alone and nobody's monitoring. Have trouble with remembering appointments. Seems like they're not showing up when they should. And daily problems with thinking or memory. Those are your indicators. So if we see changes, we should be curious. The animal fluency is a great way to do a quick check, establish baseline, and then check after them. So I say to you, name as many animals as you can. Just name one after the other until I say stop. I'm going to say go and I'm going to say stop. Just name them. Just name one after the other. And what I'm really listening for is the pattern of retrieval. I want to know if you can get about 5 to 7 animals in a grouping before you move on to another topic. I want to know whether or not you have a depth, whether you hold on to the task, whether you go off on a tangent, whether you say, I don't know, I can't do this anymore. Why are you asking me this? Because typically when you see differences in behavior here and changes, it's significant. But I can only judge if there's changes if I get a baseline. What's great is it takes 1 minute for me to gather some data. I'm looking for your ability to find and report and use language, your ability to stay on task, your ability to hold 5 to 8 chunks of information at a time and then go to the storage and retrieval area and get some more out and stay on target and not tell me a story about an animal. And I'm also looking about your depth and your vocabulary, which we know is going to grow or stay the same, but it shouldn't diminish and you shouldn't have a harder time getting to it unless something's going on. Now, we used to think that if we said you were older than 65, you had to get at least 12 in a minute, and if you were younger than 65, 18. Yeah, that's a norm, but what we're really looking at is what we should be curious about is establishing a baseline for you and compare to you over time. Because and it's very possible for somebody to get 45 in a minute. If they had 45, and the next time you saw them they were down to 35, something's going on. That is not normal aging. Dropping 1 word in a year, yeah. 10? Mm-mm. But in this scale, if I was 65 or older, and I had been getting 45, and you're looking for 12, you'd wait way too long to start noticing something's really wrong. Clock drawing. Quick way to check out your visual motor skills, your ability to hold on and interpret data, to do manipulation. So first you have them just put numbers in the clock, and then you have them put a time on the clock that has one hand on one side and one on the other. So 1:45. It requires lots of manipulation in the executive control center, but then it requires motor skill and visual skill to put it all together and to perform. It allows me to see how well can they execute. And if they have that much trouble with a clock, do I really seriously think they're taking their medications right? And this means if I have a caregiver of a person who has dementia, and that person is in palliative or hospice care, I'm going to be paying attention to them as well, because the stress of caregiving might be precipitating depression, or we might be seeing the early signs of dementia in the caregiver. Partners do sometimes both get the disease. And we notice the one that's more severe, more profound, and we miss the one in the early stages, and yet they're the ones making decisions for both. SLUMS, or St. Louis University Mental Screen, is a more in-depth. What's nice about it is it asks 3 questions about orientation only. It does ask you to remember 5 items. So it tells me whether or not you're holding on to that 5. It asks you to do a manipulation of numbers. I give you $100, you buy apples for 3 and a trike for 20. How much did you spend? What do you have left? Managing money, if you can't do this, gotta raise questions. Animal fluency, you've already done that. Clock drawing, you've already done that. Then you do number reversals. You ask them to identify 1 out of 3 shapes, and then which one is largest, which of those shapes. And then you tell them a brief story, and you ask them to give you information about the story. What's nice about the SLUMS is it does take less time. It's called a 7-minute screen. And it has a rating for high school or less than high school, and it has that in between normal, MCI, or something that really is going on here that needs a further workup. So this is a nice way of helping families to see that things are progressing, not progressing. It helps us identify who's at risk and who has something and who's okay. We should be keeping track of that because families and older adults are expecting that of us. And all too often, we don't. We're so worried about other things. So with dementia, we know lots of things change. There's structural changes and there are chemical changes, but it does not equal Alzheimer's. And it's not about memory problems. We have a great big umbrella here called dementia, and there's about 85 to 90 different forms, causes, and types underneath that umbrella. Each one is unique, and each one has special consideration. The more you work with older adults with dementia, the more you need to understand what's under this umbrella. Alzheimer's disease has several variations we understand now. Vascular dementia. It's not just multi-infarct. Lewy body dementia, frontal temporal dementias. There's a whole family, and we have a whole bunch of other dementias under this umbrella as well. The bottom line, however, when we know it's about dementia, is that there are at least 2 parts of your brain dying. It's chronic. We don't have a way to fix this disease right now. It's progressive. It's going to change over time. It's going to get worse. And ultimately, it's terminal. It's going to kill you. It is now somewhere between the 5th and the 6th leading cause of death for older adults. The challenge we face is how to recognize when it is dementia, when it is dementia plus depression, when it is dementia plus depression plus delirium, and then even more importantly, what are we going to do about that? We know where it's going to end. The question is not where will it end. The question is how will we get there?